from Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam. Reading from Srimad-Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 2, Text 8. I want to cover my clothes, but that's okay. Text 8. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Svanuṣṭhitaḥ puṁsāṁ viṣvaksena-kathāsu notpādayed yadi ratiṁ śrama kevalam. The occupational activities a man performs according to his own position are so much useless labor. They do not provoke attraction for the message of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Om Vijnana-Timirandasya Jnanam Jana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Dhyāmayam Dati Swapadantikam Mancha Lopatubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vayevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, this is it. Everyone's here? So, I'll just take this away. Oh, we lost one. Okay. So, we concluded this first anuchet with that verse, Vayam Pratina, Vayam Pratina Viveshitasya, Ishadupeta Sugara. So, the problem, one's inherent nature, is covered. The solution, the cause is one's turn from God. The solution is one should worship the Supreme Lord under the guidance of the spiritual master, considering the spiritual master as God and as very dear to oneself. This was now he's come to this solution. This is the avideya. This is the methodology according to the Bhagavatam of realizing the absolute truth. And then he's going to show further. He gave one verse. Through a series of verses, he's going to support this from 126 to 1222. How this is going to support this conception that Bhakti is the Abhideya. And in these verses, he's going to deal very, very carefully to make this very, very clear. He's going to clear up a lot of misconceptions. For example, that renunciation is not the Abhideya, the method. He's going to clear up the fact that just performing ordinary dharma is not. That this is the Abhideya, that you have to worship the Supreme Lord with causeless devotion. And then, when you want to make your argument, he's making his argument. He's not making it. He's showing how the Bhagavatam is making this argument. He shows that you become satisfied. It's such a positive. This is the only thing that can actually satisfy the self. And then he wants to show that the non-performance of it, if you don't do bhakti, it's completely inauspicious. So that's the verse. Dharmaḥ svanuṣṭhitaḥ puṁsāṁ viṣvaksena-kathāsu notpādayed ratiṁ śrama yadi kevalam. We're going to just study that verse, but I'm getting up to that. Svanuṣṭhitaḥ means, even when done properly, it's dharmaḥ svanuṣṭhitaḥ. What does the word svanuṣṭhitaḥ there mean? I 128.
128.
Yeah.
Vasudev's got it. Okay. Say the word again?
Svanuṣṭhitaḥ.
It's executed in terms of one's own position.
Yeah. So, it's useless. And then mentions Slavai means only that. Only this will actually, only this is the Parodharma. To serve the Supreme Lord with devotion. And then he confirms that, and then he refers to a verse later on, Ata pumbya dvija shreshta vanashrama sabhagasa. Samstihari Toshin, that if you're performing even activities in Vanashram, only those activities that are bhakti, that are for pleasure of God, right? And the highest good can only be, again, only that. See, savai puṁsāṁ parodharma, only that is the parodharma, and then it says the highest good, right, is Krishna's pleasure. So he's showing, he's just giving a general summary how all these verses support it. Only that is the highest dharma. And the goal of all the activities in Varnashram, the only good is to actually do them for the pleasure of the Supreme Lord. And then he brings up a verse, and he just wants to indicate very clearly that this means, if that's the only good, right, then to please Krishna, then renunciation is not the Abhideya, is not the method. Because renunciation alone is not pleasing Krishna. Renunciation alone is not devotion. And then he quotes that verse, Nais karmam api achyuta bhavam varjitam, the shobhita jnanam alam naranjam. Even nice karma, even if you do your activities without any attachment, it's free from any bondage to action. It's done without any motive. And naranjana, it's pure. If it's varjitam, if it's devoid of achyuta bhava, those activities are devoid of the sense of that's, I want to please Krishna, then the shobhyate means beautiful. They're not very attractive, those type of activities. So, these verses are all going to indicate and support his treatise, and Bhakti Sandarbha, support his treatise that it's only bhakti or devotion, which is the method for realizing the absolute truth. Because it's the only thing that can negate the cause of being covered according to the Bhagavatam, which is Ishad Upe Tasya Viparyayo Smriti. You've turned away. So the only thing that can negate the fact that you have the consciousness within you of aversion to the Supreme Lord is to devote yourself to God. So that's the only Abhideya. And yesterday, actually, we discussed a point. Therefore, if that's the only way if that's the Abhideya, and according to the Bhagavatam, if that's the only way that you can uproot the problem that's caused material existence, then any other process must be dependent on bhakti at some stage to bear its complete fruits. Aruya Katrena Param Padam Abhishuddha Buddhaya. Right? Even in Devaki's prayers it says it won't, you can't achieve your ultimate destination. Why? Abhishuddha Buddhaya. I talked to Pradyumna this morning. What is Abhishuddha Buddhaya? It says it's not without intelligence. It says Abhishuddha, Vishuddha. It's without perfect intelligence. Vishuddha means perfect intelligence. It's without, there's some impurity in there. There's some impurity in there if, and what is that impurity? That impurity must be, there's some type of aversion to the absolute. Therefore, you can't completely uproot material existence. So therefore, the sense is that bhakti in itself, anyabilashita shunya, without any karma, without any jnana, bhakti in itself, bhakti is not dependent on any other process to achieve perfection, but every other process is not independent in some form of another. And I think we had a nice discussion of that. And I think the only thing that wasn't resolved, and I think it is definitely a point for further discussion, why? The fact that it's dependent on bhakti is the conclusion of the Bhagavatam. That every other process is not independent. So I'm not sure, I agree with some of the discussion yesterday that it's not really clear exactly what that means. That jnana has to have bhakti, whether, to what extent, you have to worship, and what does that worship mean? We know in other processes there's some type of, even the people who are jnanis, they do some type of worship. Something besides analysis is within their process. We know that. And same thing with karma. So there's something else besides analysis and renunciation in their process. how that is exactly necessary, or what's the nature of that. I also agree that just coming before the deities, you put some flowers and you ask for something, that's certainly not pure bhakti. What bhakti is, it is. Yeah.
Well, doesn't Bhakti discusses in Jaiva Dharma like Jnana Vidhi Bhakti Bhas and Karma Vidhi Bhakti Bhas, that it's like in a bhas, but it's Bhakti Bhas. So
Yeah.
it's not pure, but it's
Some
still,
form.
It's like the shadow comes from the...
Yeah. Yeah. It's a question because you're approaching, but you're approaching for yourself. But maybe you're approaching God. Maybe there's something in there.
There's some city Bhakti, it's still like Bhakti, but it's pure.
Yeah, we went over that last time. What is Sangha Siddha Bhakti? What's a Rupa Siddha Bhakti? Well, my conclusion is basically Rupa Siddha Bhakti is Karma Mishra Bhakti. Because you're performing with material motive, and then you impose bhakti. Sangha Siddha Bhakti is Jnana Mishra Bhakti, in one sense, because you're performing analysis and renunciation, and you're actually focused on those things. You're not focused on Krishna, but you have a conception that I'm doing that. I'm doing that to, when I become purified, then I'll be able to focus in this, and it's kind of mixed within the process. And then Sarup Siddha Bhakti is that the activities itself, their very nature is bhakti. Even though you can do those activities in purity. And then we discussed that, therefore, one has to make sure that he has sufficient Sarup Siddha Bhakti, the practices of devotional service in his spiritual practice. Because if you do the other activities, you have to impose bhakti, and the tendency is to just do karma, and the tendency is just to do gyan. But this actually, when you do these activities, the activities themselves are bhakti. So even if you're doing them impurely, you're still getting some benefit. Even nam-aparad purifies. But if you do those other activities, and you do karma, you don't give the fruits of the activities, you get no benefit. But if you do gyan, and you get lost, and it's not done, it's not really done, you lose the objective, that the goal is to focus on Krishna, even though you're practicing detachment and austerities, etc., then you get no benefit.
Is that where the question is, that because there's no benefit and how it's dependent?
The question is that it is dependent. The question is, how is it dependent? It's very, very clear. It's very, very clear from that bhakti is independent. It's very, very clear that every other process is dependent on bhakti. But how is it dependent on bhakti to achieve perfection? Is it that you have to perform bhakti in the process of jnana, or for the process of jnana to achieve perfection, you have to come to the process of bhakti to achieve perfection? So it's not exactly clear. That's something I think I have to research further in the Bhakti Sandarbha. What Jiva Goswami's arguments are. Why exactly every other process is dependent on bhakti? Independently, you can't achieve perfection. One analysis that I heard is that the reason it's dependent is because there has to be some worship in it. But then the question came yesterday, well, what is that worship? Right? What is the if the worship is for jnana, if you're worshiping and your objective is in personal liberation, is that bhakti? But there's some question of approaching God. There's some process of trying to get something, some descent of some kind of mercy. Anytime there's some type of worship, even if it's to the demigods, there's some concept of that. So the question is that really bhakti? Because sometimes you worship demigods. So it's not really clear. It's understood that within itself, there's some limits according to our philosophy. But really what has to be discussed and delved further is what is the bhakti that is required in the process of jnana, according to our tradition, to achieve perfection. Because that's true, that Vishwanath says it, everyone says it, that these processes are not sufficient in itself. And then that reference in the Bhagavatam, viṣvaksena-kathāsu. What's the beginning of that verse? You know that verse? Oh my God, I forgot all my verses. That's good. What? What? What's the first thing? Oh, yenye ravindaksha vamuktamaniyas tuasta bhavata vashuddha buddhiya aruya katrena param padam. Yenye ravindaksha vamuktamaniyas, you don't achieve it. Somehow, of a Shuddha Buddhiya, you don't have viṣvaksena Buddhiya. It's not that you don't have it's not that you don't have Shuddha Buddhiya. It's not that you don't have good intelligence. You don't have very, very good intelligence. There's something lacking in that. So, it's not clear to me exactly. And the verses that he says that indicate this is Vasudeva, Bhagavati, Bhakti Yoga, Piyojita, Janyasu Vairagyam. And then this one, dharmaḥ, svanuṣṭhitaḥ, puṁsāṁ, viṣvaksena-kathāsu, notpādayed. And everything else is useless, he says, if it doesn't lead to ratiṁ. So there's some conception. I think here's the point that we can agree on. That what he's presenting is there's some conception that unless you develop attraction for God and some devotion, that whatever you do will not bear its fruits. So the only question left to me is whether you have to perform bhakti while you're doing jnana, or whether jnana at the end leads to bhakti. But there's something deficient, and this is what Śrīmad-Bhāgavatam Swami is presenting, because he's presenting bhakti as the abhideya, the method of realizing the absolute truth. So that's really but that point is very, very clear. And he says that these two verses indicate that. He'll actually say that. He'll say from these two verses, 7 and 8, quote in the beginning, is understood that bhakti is independent. Whereas bhakti is not dependent on karma and jnana. You get it just from executing devotional service. And you get it easily. Asu. You get it easily. It means just with a little bit of hearing, you get that jnana in bhakti. You hear about it, you understand it. So all those other things come by bhakti. But dharmaḥ, svanuṣṭhitaḥ, puṁsāṁ, whatever you do, viṣvaksena-kathāsu, if it doesn't lead to this ratiṁ, śrama, kevalam, it's not going to have any value. So that indicates that no other activity is independent of bhakti, and Vasudeva Bhagavati, bhakti is independent of every other activity, because with bhakti comes everything. And then he also quoted the other verse, Yasyasti bhaktir bhagavat akinchana saraigunasthatha samasta, that when you perform bhakti, all the good qualities come. So the idea is, with bhakti, you get everything else you need. But any other process, independent of bhakti, doesn't have value. So the only point, I think, of confusion, and I really appreciated the discussion, is what does that mean in the process of jnana? Well, yes?
Well, there's two ways that I've heard that, just quickly, that I've heard it explained. And
Yeah. I want to hear
what you thought of that.
Yeah.
Okay, the first thing is that the jnana process and the karma process involve elements of bhakti in them which don't make sense within the jnana and karma process.
The process of what?
The process of jnana
Yeah.
involves elements of bhakti, like you have to be devoted to it. You have to have some faith in it. You have to have, you have to have certain faith and devotion in it, which doesn't make, faith and devotion doesn't make sense in the Gyan path. It's like an element. It's like a part of the process that doesn't. If you actually look at it, you shouldn't need faith and devotion to within the paradigm of Gyan.
Yeah.
So that was one kind of explanation. I don't know what you...
Well, that kind of supports the first one. Then that is devotion.
Yeah.
Because then the question will come, is that really bhakti, just having faith and devotion in anything?
Right.
Or having faith and devotion in Gyan, is that bhakti?
Right.
Because I've heard, but I haven't reasoned it out fully, that there's some, when you do something, there has to come something from the above. Yes, Adi?
Yeah, in all the scriptures, there's references to that it may seem vague, but then you can understand. Tadvidi pranipatana. Approach a genuine spiritual master. So whether a person's a jnani or whatever, if they hear that, a genuine spiritual master, and they say, all right, I want to find a genuine spiritual master, then Krishna reciprocates. And whether somebody has a propensity to just acquire knowledge or has a propensity for whatever, the spiritual master can dovetail that propensity in the house of bhakti and bring you to the platform of pure devotional service. Because otherwise you're talking about 0 to 60 in no time at all. Like, okay, you have to be unceasing and unmotivated devotional service and then you'll be satisfied. You just jump into that? No, there's a guru, there's a person.
Yeah.
If you eliminate the conception of surrendering, of desiring a spiritual master and surrendering and obedience and serving somebody who actually is in the house of bhakti, then even bhakti doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But with guru, it pulls all the pieces together, connects the dots, and from wherever you are, you can get there.
And therefore, he said Guru Devatma. That you have to worship Guru with faith and devotion, with bhakti.
And even a person who doesn't know what a real guru is, if they just have those two words, genuine guru, worshipable guru, and they desire that, Sarvasya Chaham Hridhi, Krishna in the heart gives them that, because that's what they're asking for. I want a real one.
Thank you.
Right? Even if they don't know what it is, if they say, I want a real one, Krishna knows.
Okay, the second kind of explanation that I understood is that it's like unavoidable within the process of jnana that there's some appeal to bhakti. Just like if you look at impersonalists, they turn to the Bhagavatam. Buddhists, you find that their text is totally on a jnana process, but you see the reality of it is they're doing deity worship, they're doing so their process to actually make their process work, they're just inherently.
But what I'm saying is that supports the first contention.
Yeah.
That is bhakti. But the purva-paksha, the opposing idea was if it's not really to Krishna or it's not done with, or it's done with motive, how is that bhakti? But that's the general conception. The general conception is there has to be some worship or devotion. Right. And in one sense, it's to some supreme, it's to some greater being. Yeah. So that, and the concept is for the perfection, there has to be some descent above you. There has to be something coming down. So anyway, I think I'm going to research this further. Maybe you can... I want to go on a little bit. Okay. I'm going to research this further, where I saw it and how it's discussed more in different verses. Maybe the next time. It's
not just cleared up by the idea that if they're not practicing pure bhakti, there's bhakti. It's dependent on bhakti, but it's just not
pure bhakti. Okay. Yeah, I think if it's, the question is, it has a motive. Yeah. One is that it has a motive, but it's to Krishna, right? The verse Chatur biha bhajanti mam jana sukritinoja. Those people have sukriti. Yeah. Now they approach Krishna, but they're approaching Krishna with motive, right? But they've come to Krishna. Yeah. So they're with motive, but they've come to Krishna. Right. But it's their sukriti. The piety. and allow them to approach Krishna. And then I guess the other one is you're approaching with devotion, but it's not Krishna. It's a misconception. So there's some element of devotion, worship, something external. I guess the main point is Gyan is not independent. There has to be some, it's not pure bhakti, there has to be some, as Radhanath said, some humility, some approach, you know, the 12-step program, you know, a higher power, you know, nothing works without some mercy. And it seems that that element is there. And what these verses indicate is bhakti is independent, everything else comes. But the other process, even done perfectly, they're useless if rati doesn't come. Here's the point.
Sure.
And what's the rati to? Now we're getting dharmaḥ svanuṣṭhitaḥ puṁsāṁ viṣvaksena-kathāsu. It's to Krishna. So here, even it's going further. The rati or devotion has to be to Krishna. So maybe it's the what's the verse? Bahunam jantanam ante gyanavam papadyate vasudeva sasamiti samahatma. That, you know, after many, many years of this, the Mahatma comes to God. You know, so maybe it's this conception also. That from practicing for some, but that's a secondary point, exactly what it is. But the point is, bhakti is the everyday tattva. It's the method. It's not dependent on anything else. Everything else. Now I'd like to, because I don't have much time, and I'm going to go to 8 o'clock. I'm taking that leeway here. Let's now go to those verses. Let's just see what he says about this verse, dharmaḥ svanuṣṭhitaḥ puṁsāṁ, viṣvaksena-kathāsu. Okay, yeah. So he says, applying negative concomitant, Sutta Goswami says. So he wants to show if you don't do bhakti, then what happens? Because he wants to say you should do bhakti. So you want to do bhakti, here's the good, here's what happens when you don't do it. So he says, then he quotes the verse, if the proper execution of prescribed duties for human beings does not induce attraction to the narrations of Lord Vasudeva, such performance is indeed fruitless labor. If the performance of one's duty is not directed towards the satisfaction of Krishna, and hence does not create a taste for hearing the descriptions as pastimes, it's merely labor devoid of any fruit. You work all day, there's no payment. And he's going to give some really good verses from the Bhagavatam to show that if you do any other process, there's no payment unless it leads to this attraction. So I think by our discussion, I think this point is becoming clear. Why it's not independent is because it can't bear any fruit until it comes to the point of devotion. And he's going to describe that with everything. The next verse is going to be dharmasya yapavargasya. And you know what Jiva Goswami says about that verse? Dharmasya, what is it? Dharma is meant for liberation. But you know what he says apavargasya means? He says it means bhakti. And he gives reference from the Bhagavatam. There's references from the Bhagavatam how apavarga, or liberation, means bhakti. And then he gives a verse, how dharma leads to bhakti. And how dharma leads to bhakti? Because if you're pious, then you'll create, you're pious, you'll welcome sadhus. You'll treat sadhus respectably. And by that, a devotee may come to your home. So that's how dharma leads to. And in this conception, if the devotee doesn't come to your home, then dharmaḥ svanuṣṭhitaḥ puṁsāṁ, because it's useless. But if you're a pious person, and we've seen this, that there are many pious people that, you know, they just saw devotees, invited them into their home, and then they became devotees. So dharma means, so I'm going to read it. So a taste for hearing the stories of the Lord is specifically mentioned here because it is always the primary step and also the best. By mention of a taste for the narration of the Lord, a taste for other types of services applied. He mentioned specifically bhakti because Śrama and Kirtan, it all begins by hearing. But when he says, dharmaḥ puṁsāṁ viṣvaksena-kathāsu, what is it? Dharmaḥ puṁsāṁ viṣvaksena-kathāsu, notpādayed yadi ratiṁ. If you don't have rati for this, he says it also implies other devotional activities. But they mention hearing because it's the primary thing, it's the first essential. But it is analysis for someone who says, well, hey, what about that guy that likes to serve? Or what about that guy that likes to worship the deity? He said, no, this also includes that. But hearing is the first thing. It means coming to bhakti. This is beautiful now. The emphatic particle eva only, which strengthens the word śrama of futile labor, indicates the perishability of heavenly realms and other similar results attained through goal-oriented prescribed. So he says eva means pravritti mark is absolutely useless. Because from pravritti mark, you get the heavenly planets, you get a material result, and it's perishable. That's absolutely useless. If you're going to work so hard and you're going to get something that disappears, that's ending, it's useless. Similarly, the particle he, indeed, also lending stress to the word śrama, indicates logical proof from the Vedas. So the verse says it's useless. But how is it useless? He said, śrama eva hi kevalam. So it's very interesting because śrama means useless. So śrama eva, certainly, he, indeed. Śrama eva hi kevalam. It's only useless. It's certainly useless. It's indeed useless. But he says śrama, futile, useless. He said eva, strengthens, is only useless. He said, because why? You perform some dharma to get some material result, and then it's perishable. What kind of benefit is that? But then he says he, the word he, indicates the Vedas. And I've explained before that sometimes in a spiritual discussion, someone will make a statement and then go, Om. And when they say, this is the Bhagavatam too, in the what is that, the wives of the Brahmins, is some, when the Brahmins really, there's one point where they really want to confirm that they've blown it, and they go Om, and then the commentary says Om is a phrase that's used that indicates that this is authorized. So mostly he's saying he, indeed, indeed. In that kind of culture, when you say he, indeed, it mentions this is Vedic. So then he gives the discussion. He said, from the Chandogya Upanishad, and he quotes, just as the results acquired by fruit of action in the world perish, the results attained through virtuous action in heaven also perish. So he goes Upanishads. Now he's going to do kevalam and show how kevalam means, it's why he says again. Because he says śrama eva only, and then kevalam only again. The second, the kevalam means also nivritti marg is useless. So yes, nivritti marg is also useless. You perform renunciation without bhakti, that's also useless. So he says that here. He said, according to the Amakosh dictionary, the indeclinable word kevalam also follows śrama, meaning conclusive. This rendering of the word kevalam indicates that knowledge resulting from prescribed action performed merely for the sake of duty is unachievable if devoid of devotion, and even such knowledge obtained is also perishable. So even if you perform it not for some material result, but merely for the sake of duty, you're doing it in a very detached way. So that's also useless. So you got śrama, eva, he, kevalam. Śrama, useless. Śrama, eva, pravritti marg, he, indeed, this is supported by the Vedas. In kevalam, it's conclusive that it's only It's conclusive. Why is it conclusive? Because even if you do it not fruitively, it's also useless if it doesn't lead to ratiṁ. So therefore, jnana, karma, are not independent as the abhideya, as the methodology for realizing the absolute truth. Alone, they cannot achieve it. That we're sure about. Moreover, the particle he indicates proof from the shruti. So it means proof. So now he's just going to give more proofs. And we'll appreciate the verses from Svetashwara Upanishads. He quotes Yasya Deve Parabhaktir Yata Deve Tata Guru. The meaning of the teachings described is revealed only to the great souls who has supreme devotion unto the Lord and the same quality of devotion to his or her teacher. So again, it indicates, that verse means, unless you have devotion to Guru and the Lord, then you don't understand. You won't get the knowledge necessary to achieve perfection. Implicit faith, unless there's implicit faith in the spiritual master, the imports of the Vedas are not revealed. And I think it's basically something, the imports of the Vedas is what? The imports of the Vedas is you should surrender. So basically that means unless you do it, unless you do it, you're not going to understand the Vedas, because that's what the Vedas are about. It's about, the Vedas is what? Vedaischa sarveham eva vedyo vedanta vid evachaham. Of all the Vedas, I am to be known. So that's the conclusion of the Vedas, that you should surrender. So unless you have that faith, and you're actually engaged in that activity, you will not see it in the Vedas. And that's also mentioned before, that if you have that you really, by hearing the scriptures once, you should become immediately devoted. And that's what the Bhagavatam says in the second verse, that at once you become devoted. But that doesn't happen to everyone. Why? Because they're not surrendered, they have desires, and that colors their perception. And therefore, the message of the Vedas is not exactly, at the moment, what they really want to hear. So when you're hearing something that's against your desire, it doesn't sink in. You have to hear it again and again and again. So this verse, it says that unless you have implicit faith in Guru and Krishna, you don't understand the Vedas, because you don't have a perspective, because you're not acting on that platform. So then he said the word he also alludes to similar proofs, as stated in the Bhagavatam. Then he quotes that verse again. So we can understand when a verse is repeated, how important it is. Naish karmam api achyuta bhava varjitam nishovyate jnanabalam. He said, even nice karma, you're doing the activities without any fruit. Niranjanam, it's pure. Achyuta bhava varjitam, if it's not done with bhava for God. Nishovyate, I really like that verse. Nishovyate, it's not, shovyate means beautiful. It's not attractive. Even that's not attractive. So again, that word he, indeed, he's showing that this means this is so certain and it's supported by all the Shastra. Then he gives another verse, 10:14:4. Vasudev, this is Lord Brahma's prayer. You know it? What? What is that one where it's like beating an empty husk?
Oh, Sayasitim
I think you're young, but you're getting Alzheimer's. It says, "O Lord, those of you up the auspicious path of bhakti and struggle for impersonal realization only achieve misery." So that's another nice reference. So you can see he's really supporting this from this one word. And then what about this, 10.2.32? This is Yenye Ravindaksha Mamukta Maniyas Tvayasta Bhava Ravashuddha Guriya Arudya Kachena Parampadam. That if you don't worship, those who disrespect your lotus feet fall down even after elevating themselves to an exalted position with great difficulty. So if you're of a Shuddha Buddhaya, if your intelligence is not completely pure, which means you don't understand the supreme absolute reality, then even if you go with so much difficulty and achieve a high point, then you're going to have to come down. You won't ultimately achieve perfection. So it's obvious from these verses then what is the conclusion of these verses? Can I have till 8 today? Is that possible?
Jnana is the ultimate path.
What?
That's the ultimate conclusion.
That what?
Jnana is the ultimate, highest path.
Thank you. That's why you have to repeat things again and again and again. Can I have 5 more minutes?
Of course.
Okay. Any comments, Yadi, on this? No. Adi?
Yeah, it seems like it's, if you can't do it unless you're totally pure, then it's hopeless without the guru.
Yeah.
Right? That's what
Yeah.
it keeps pointing for me.
Yeah.
That's what seems to be saying, that unless you do, you could be serving a great soul who does, it is pure devotion,
Yeah.
and then what you do is pure devotion.
I think, I'll mention this point too, is that I think what this points to, and it's also there in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, why he mentions Ishvara Pranidhana. And the commentators make that very, very clear. And there's beautiful references that it's very difficult to achieve perfection without the mercy of God. So in yoga, you meditate on one thing, and he says you can meditate on anything, because it's a psychological process, how the mind gets controlled. But if you study it very carefully, meditating on God as designated in mantras is recommended. And in the commentary is a very interesting point. It says when you meditate on God, it's not just a meditational prop, but the object of your worship can intervene and help you achieve your perfection. So I think this is the point. And if you actually study, I've studied the Yoga Sutras, you cannot imagine the level of focus and concentration. And it's unbelievable. There's 7 levels of samadhi to achieve perfection. So therefore, there has to be some mercy. And mercy is the love that comes in relationship from above. So when you have respect and devotion, maybe Bhakti True Swami mentioned this, in relationship, respect goes upwards and mercy comes downwards. So without that respect, without that devotion, you're not going to achieve perfection. It's not going to come down. And therefore he concludes that these 2 verses, quote, it is understood that bhakti is independent, where jnana and vairagya depend on bhakti. In this way, dharma is said to be only fruitful when it results in bhakti. So I think this is the clear conclusion, that no other process will achieve its fruits unless it culminates in devotion. I think that's the conclusion. And I have 1 more minute, and I'll just say the next verse is also very beautiful, dharma yapa vargasya, because some people mean that to think that dharma, because it's being discussed, what is your duty? Some people think that duty is meant for wealth. And that's a common thing, dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. But what they say here is that the class is finished. Thank you.